McCarty, and I'm the chair of the politics department here at Princeton. And it's my honor this afternoon to introduce our speaker, Ira Katznelson, who will deliver the first of two lectures in the series, The Princeton Lectures in Politics and Public Affairs. His lectures will be entitled The People and the State, Reflections on American Political Development. And these lectures are co-sponsored by the Woodrow Wilson School, the Center for the Study of Democratic Politics, and the Princeton University Press. Katznelson is known for his influential research on urban politics, liberal state, inequality, social knowledge, and institutions, primarily focusing on the United States, although his work has also straddled comparative politics and political theory, as well as political and social history. A 1966 graduate of Columbia University, Katznelson earned his PhD in history from Cambridge University in 1969. Shortly thereafter, he founded the respectable journal Politics and Society. Respected. I knew Ira would catch. I knew Ira would catch that. Katznelson taught at Columbia from 1969 to 1974, at the University of Chicago from 1974 to 1983, and at the New School for Social Research from 1983 to 1994. He had been chairs of departments both at Chicago and as well as served as the dean of the New School. But in 1994, Katznelson returned to Columbia as the Ruggles Professor of Political Science and History. He is the author and co-author and co-editor of almost 24 books and published more than 60 articles. His major works include Black Men, White Cities, Race, Politics, and Migration in the United States, City Trenches, Urban Politics, and the Patterning of Class in the United States, Liberalism's Crooked Circle, Letters to Adam Michnik, Desolation and Enlightenment, Political Knowledge After Total War, Totalitarianism, and Holocaust, and more recently, When Affirmative Action Was White, An Untold History of Racial Inequality in the 20th Century America. Liberalism's Crooked Circle earned him APSA, the American Political Science Association's Michael Harrington Prize, and Desolation and Enlightenment won him the David and Elaine Spitz Award of the Conference of Political Thought, which is given to the best book in liberal or democratic theory. Recently, he has concluded a book entitled Fear Itself, New Deal Democracy in a Southern Cage, which will be forthcoming from Norton next summer, and has compiled Liberal Reason, a collection of his essays on the character of modern social knowledge. Katznelson has served as the president of the American Political Science Association. He served as the president of the Politics and History section of that association, the president of the Social Science History Association, and he is the chair of the Russell Sage Foundation Board of Trustees. He has been a Guggenheim Fellow, been a Fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and the American Philosophical Association. So welcome, Ira.
Nolan, I was going to thank you for that gracious introduction, but I'll thank you for the respectable one. Thanks so much. And thanks to Princeton University Press, the Woodrow Wilson School, the Center for the Study of Democratic Politics, three uncommonly estimable institutions who have sponsored this talk and invited me to deliver this season's Princeton Lectures in Politics and Public Affairs. And I want to say a special thank you to my longtime friend and editor, Chuck Myers of the Press, the guiding spirit behind these lectures. Now, I face a daunting challenge, particularly as I'm following Yale's David Mayhew, one of my intellectual heroes who delivered the inaugural lecture series last year or 2 years ago now transformed into an excellent and often surprising book called Partisan Balance, arguing that elections are the driving force that makes productive government possible. Mayhew's Princeton lectures sought to show that popular sovereignty, exercised through mechanisms of political representation, is alive and well at the heart of the national state. In his account of post-World War II policymaking, presidents propose, Congress acts, and despite polarization, the median voter thrives. In this way, Mayhew characteristically uses careful empirical analysis to upend conventional understanding. You will discover that I, too, am concerned with popular sovereignty. Though not unique to the United States, it was within these shores that popular sovereignty gained particular force. Fashioned by a revolution conducted in the name of we the people, America's founding invented a people more powerful than the citizenry crafted by the country from which it separated. Great Britain's earlier parliamentary revolution was limited by the durability of the monarchy, the persistence of aristocracy, and the absence of explicit constitutional stipulations. Without these constraints, popular sovereignty soared in a republic of equal citizens designed for freedom. This government, by consent, opened wider doors than ever before to human liberty. In the 13 colonies of British North America, then in the United States of America, people who in England, Scotland, Wales, Ireland, France, and Germany had been considered politically superfluous burst into political life as participants in representative government, as rebels, as voters, as liberal citizens. America's new idea, the Princeton historian R.R. Palmer wrote, in the age of democratic revolutions, was the idea that sovereignty lay with the people. But which people? With what rights? Included in which institutions? From the start, popular sovereignty in America was tormented by a stark division between the entitled and the unqualified. The idea of we the people was hedged by conditions. As the Yale historian Edmund Morgan notes, the founding pioneered an expanded idea of freedom, but only among the free. The development of America's remarkable freedom was intimately and inherently tied to and supported by captivity and systematic oppression. There was something different about the Indians, Morgan wrote. Whatever the particular nation or tribe or group they belonged to, they were not civil, not Christian, perhaps not quite human, in the way that white Christian Europeans were. It was no good trying to give them a stake in society. They stood outside society. So, of course, did African slaves. To a large degree, Morgan averred, it may be said that Americans bought their independence with slave labor. This combination of popular sovereignty amongst equals, together with strong patterns of exclusion, has pressed forward a series of haunting questions that have preoccupied and troubled the United States for more than 2 centuries. Who, in theory and in fact, constitutes the people? Which persons qualify for membership? Based on what criteria? How are rules to be set that link the eligible, the ineligible, and the potentially eligible to the state? What happens at the frontier where membership in the liberal state is adjudicated? Under what conditions are barriers to the status of liberal citizen raised or lowered? There are tens upon tens range of exclusion, slavery, to small but telling instances, like the gathering of the Rules Committee of South Carolina's Democratic State Convention in Columbia on May 21st, 1942. By a vote of 40-1, its members resolved to keep the party's upcoming September primary all white, despite a petition by a small group of liberals that had called attention to the war against Nazism and raised questions about the propriety of excluding black soldiers. As in much of the Deep South, this was the only election that mattered in what essentially was a one-party system. The next month, the two leading candidates for governor, Wyndham Manning, who later in 1947 was appointed superintendent of South Carolina's prison system by Governor Strom Thurmond, and the fervent New Dealer, Olin Johnston, who went on to defeat Manning in the primary and later became a leading voice for segregation in the U.S. Senate, discussed problems of war and peace at a June 9 mass meeting in Lexington, called to consider the impact of World War II on the state. "I believe in white voters staying in the Democratic Party," said Johnston. "If the colored people want a party, let them organize one." Manning replied, "I'm surprised that such a question should be raised. The Democratic Party is a white man's party and must so be maintained." Now, my discussion of the people and the state, a consideration that primarily focuses on how a liberal and democratic political system based on popular sovereignty has been entwined with racial assumptions and exclusions ever since its revolutionary founding, stands on the shoulders of three intellectual giants: the Columbia University historian Richard Hofstadter, the University of Chicago political scientist J. David Greenstone, and the Harvard political theorist Judith Shklar. Hofstadter was my teacher. He opened my eyes to the possibility of doing analytical history when long ago, during the 1965-66 academic year, a year of escalation in Vietnam and conflagration in America's cities, he supervised my fourth-year undergraduate thesis on the race riots of 1919. He guided me to understand those terrible events as a set of civil conflicts about citizenship and race. He also introduced me to a resonant essay he had written a decade earlier on history and the social sciences. There, he had counseled scholars to treat as potentially creative the tensions that are generated when the social scientific quest for verifiable facts, rigorous knowledge, and systematic models collides with the historical quest to understand unique events, particular times, and distinctive places. To this end, Hofstadter called for the emergence of what he labeled a new historical genre, which will be a mixture of traditional history and the social sciences. It will differ from the narrative history of the past, he wrote, in that its primary purpose will be analytical. It will be informed by the insights of the social sciences, and at some points will make use of the methods they have originated. Ever since, I've lived my scholarly life at the intersection of two disciplines: history, where I earned my degrees, and political science, where I primarily have located my professional identification. At just that junction, a turn to history, in tandem with a focus on the meaning and power of institutions, has shaped the still young political science subfield of American political development, an intellectual community that pursues the goals Hofstadter wanted his fellow historians to take up. APD, as it is called, neither aspires to offer a full-blown political history of the United States, nor does it use historical data to test ideas and theories that first were generated outside of history. Rather, the research program it has been pursuing is worthy of consideration as a field of inquiry, as two of its key practitioners, Stephen Skowronek and Karen Oren, have argued, because it harbors an approach to political analysis all its own. It grapples with the historical construction of politics and with political arrangements of different origins operating in times together. Somewhere, I trust, Richard Hofstadter is smiling. David Greenstone became a dear friend and close colleague at the University of Chicago. As a moving truck was being unloaded at our family's new Blackstone Avenue home on a hot day nearly 40 years ago, in late August 1974, David stopped by as my new department chair to offer greetings. But there was none of the expected small talk about the logistics of transition or my journey from New York. Instead, his very first words that day were these, precisely these: "What do you think of Lewis Hartz?" I had no idea. The Liberal Tradition in America was a book I had merely skimmed and did not understand, so I mumbled an anodyne reply. David responded with a characteristically warm yet piercing, quizzical look. He stayed for hours to instruct me. We talked and talked. By day's end, I had learned that he was convinced that Hartz's landmark volume, despite many limitations, should continue to inspire and challenge scholarship in American history and politics. But I already could hear a line of criticism in David's rat-a-tat speech. The West's liberal political tradition he was instructing is a good deal more than the set of ethical, political, and philosophical thoughts associated with Hartz's hero, John Locke, or other leading liberal thinkers like John Stuart Mill and John Rawls. Liberalism, David believed, is best understood as a living and heterogeneous family of practices, compounds of ideas, institutions, and patterns of behavior that are premised on government by consent, the rule of law, equal political rights for eligible citizens, and limits on executive power, as well as institutions that disperse authority and provide means for political representation. I call this evening's talk the liberal premise. For this issue, all roads still lead to Hartz's dense, elusive, often repetitive, but astonishingly brilliant, provocative, and daring book. By reviewing and amending Hartz's arguments, I will try at long last to answer the question David Greenstone put to me so many years ago, not as an exercise in itself, but in an effort to identify how we might parse and solve puzzles about the terms of engagement between race and America's liberal polity. Greenstone posthumously published book, The Lincoln Persuasion, published by Princeton University Press, told us what he thought of Hartz. Subtitled Remaking American Liberalism, that evocative volume revised the liberal tradition in America by identifying what Greenstone believed to be a fundamental bipolarity in American liberalism. While each tendency shared such tenets as government by consent and individual rights, Greenstone distinguished what he called a humanist liberalism that sought to satisfy individual preferences from what he called reform liberalism, a perspective that stresses the obligation of humans to find both collective and individual means to develop their human faculties. I refer to this distinction on Thursday. Based on the Tanner Lectures she delivered in May 1989 at the University of Utah, Judith Shklar's beautifully realized last book, American Citizenship: The Quest for Inclusion, explores the interplay of race and American liberalism. In these essays, she wrote, "I shall try to show, however briefly, the enormous impact that not merely the institution of black chattel slavery, but servitude as an integral part of a modern, popular, representative republic dedicated to the blessings of liberty, has had on the way Americans think about citizenship. Her sharply etched book offers the model I hope to pursue when I write a book that I'm committed to write for the press based on the subjects of these lectures. Richard Hofstadter died in 1970 at age 54. David Greenstone died in 1990, just 52. Judith Shklar died in 1992, still young, at 63. These lectures are gratefully dedicated to their memory. My main interlocutor in these talks is the leading scholar of race working within the ambit of American political development, the American political development subfield, Roger Smith of the University of Pennsylvania. This is not a talk behind his back. He and I have been in robust email conversation about these lectures, and he has commitments, he wanted me to say, hardwired ones at Penn, that does not allow him to be here. But believe you me, I will hear about these lectures from him. In any event, he is my main interlocutor. Taking note of the explosion of scholarship on race in the United States, Professor Smith has insisted that empirical information is not enough. Even as our factual knowledge has grown by leaps and bounds, our conceptualizations and our theories, he has rightly argued, have not kept pace. I fully share his view that we need guiding theoretical foundations to organize what we know, to shape analytical choices about the subjects we study, and guide studies of race into the heart of how we come to understand the American experience. No one has done more than Professor Smith to bring race from the periphery to the center of American political studies, or provide such underpinnings. And two of his contributions to theory are especially noteworthy. First is the idea of multiple traditions, in which ascription, by which he primarily has meant racism, vies as a co-equal source of ideas, values, and institutions in American life with two other traditions, liberalism and republicanism. Second is a more recent elaboration, advanced in conjunction with Oxford's Desmond King, that distinguishes what they call a white supremacist racial order and what they designate as an egalitarian racial order that competes with racism and seeks to transform American society by overcoming it. Now, scholars of American political development have been drawn to the idea of path dependency, the notion that once a branching decision is made about which road to follow, it is difficult to double back or recover, so that future directions depend on what happens at critical junctures. The crucial branching decision that Rogers Smith made in his rich theoretical writings came with his decision to reject Lewis Hartz's claim that liberalism has been the dominant tradition in American life, with a place at the top of the country's lexical hierarchy. This dismissal offers the implicit covering idea for Smith and King's conceptualization of competing racial orders. Their Racial Orders article of 2005 is silent about the status of liberalism, and tellingly, it contains not one reference to Lewis Hartz. This is a branching decision to which I do not subscribe. It was a mistake, I believe, to have left the liberal tradition in America behind at the first junction Smith encountered. Taking a different fork, I should like to suggest an alternative analytical pathway, one that revises Hartz's book rather than move away from it, in order to better integrate the study of race and racism with the liberal tradition. This is the task I undertake in this evening's lecture, the liberal premise. On Thursday, I'll try to build on this extension of Hartz by integrating Greenstone's version of a liberal bipolarity with Smith and King's idea of a racial bipolarity. You will see that, like Hartz, I am convinced that racial conflict in America is best comprehended not as outside, but as an integral part of America's political liberalism. This emphasis, I believe, changes the questions we ask, alters what we see, and how we explain. But I begin with Hearts by way of Roger Smith's powerful critique. I still remember the physical jolt I received when the September 1993 issue of the American Political Science Review landed on my desk. The lead article was Smith's essay, an audacious essay, called Beyond Tocqueville, Myrdal, and Hearts, and it was subtitled The Multiple Traditions in America. Hearts was one of his principal targets. In elaborating a critique, Smith correctly observed how Hearts had portrayed conflicts in American history as conflicts within liberal boundaries. Smith rejected this view for two reasons. The idea of a single and dominant liberal tradition, he argued, marginalizes a separate republican tradition, a tradition characteristic of ancient Greece and Rome that stresses civic responsibility, strong citizenship, and manly virtues. Second, and even more important, Smith stressed how Hearts had downplayed the key categories of attribution and identity in American life, including gender, but especially those associated with race and racism. American thought, Smith maintained, is not defined by a single and primary core value based on the liberalism of Locke, as Hearts had argued, but on these three distinct traditions, only one of which is liberal. Racism, he argued, is not an exception on liberalism's margins, but constitutes a compelling and unfortunately powerful tradition of its own. Only by treating racism as separate and co-equal, Smith averred, does it become possible to comprehend the bitter blends of racism and liberalism that have run so deeply in American thought. Smith identified Alexis de Tocqueville as the founder of the unitary liberal thesis. Smith summarized how, in Democracy in America, Tocqueville had argued that, quote, America, I'm quoting Smith, not Tocqueville, that America has been most shaped by the unusually free and egalitarian ideas and material conditions that prevailed at its founding. And he further observed, quote, how a distinguished line of writers, including Harriet Martineau and Lord Bryce in the 19th century, and Gunnar Myrdal and Louis Hearts in the 20th century, serve as authority for this view, a view he thought flawed. Immediately following was a sentence that you will understand grabbed my attention, even though I knew that it was unduly flattering. Today, Smith wrote, leading social scientists such as Samuel Huntington, Walter Dean Burnham, and Ira Katznelson still structure their accounts on these flawed premises. Adding, virtually all appeal to the classic analysis of American politics, Tocqueville's Democracy in America. He was right, I thought, about my commitments, but wrong about their implications for the study of race. When Smith's Civic Ideals, a great book, was published 6 years later, I explained why I was not ready to sign up to the multiple traditions template, and why I thought it to be a mistake to set aside the perspective of liberal hegemony in order to interrogate the relationship linking race to that tradition. Drawing on David Greenstone's understanding that liberalism constitutes a thick and complex set of practices, I argued in a published review that Smith's empirical observations about citizenship in America had outrun the conceptual frame that generated them. For the effect of Smith's upbraiding of Hearts for his neglect of racism was partially vitiated by his own separation of the ascriptive from the liberal strand of thought, as if they were sealed and separate. By so doing, I wrote, Smith had fashioned against his own intentions a conceptual mirror image to Hartz's consideration of liberalism. By bringing racism in as he does, he has constructed, I wrote, a virtually identical account in which an idealized and purified, even essentialized liberalism makes an appearance. Whenever racism rears its ugly head, this is taken as confirmation of the non-liberal strand, rather than as a commentary on the liberal tradition itself. Smith was right to stress how Hartz had failed to deal adequately with race in the liberal tradition. But by forcing a choice between one tradition or three, Smith reproduced his own criticism by offering us a cleansed and too simple liberal tradition. Thus, he missed the chance to show how the American liberal tradition had come to be inextricably intertwined with race and racism, and how each came to constitute key features of the other. A dozen years later, I stand by this critique, but I also realize that it fell short. For what I did not do was explain why, and more importantly, how I would wish to hold on to a view that Smith had criticized so thoughtfully. To begin that journey, I returned to Hartz to argue that a designation of the priority of liberalism need not rule out a focus on the protean and often independent powers of racism, either as a matter of logic or of fact. Bringing race to the center of American political development does not require denying the liberal premise of Hartz, as Smith thought it must, but it does necessitate rejecting hermetically sealed and sanitized versions of the liberal tradition. I do not embrace Hartz's arguments unrevised or unextended. Rather, I wrestle with his too simple and too linear view of American liberalism, that is, Hartz's too simple and too linear view. By attending to the presence of some feudal aspects in America, by identifying the ties that join republicanism and liberalism, and above all, by offering an account of the mechanisms that have governed the charged and quite intimate connections joining liberalism and racism, I should like to explore in these lectures how liberalism has regulated its criteria for political membership and how liberal political arrangements have organized both the reproduction and contraction of racism. In all, I am seeking a less credulous but still appreciative understanding of the liberal tradition, a quest motivated by the conviction, a normative conviction, that no good polity can exist without liberal ideas and instruments. Like my former student, Catherine Holland, I accept that the American liberal political tradition contains elements other than liberalism. But like Holland, I note that liberalism, I'm quoting, that liberalism itself incorporates non-liberal, even illiberal conventions. If we overreact to the country's manifest heterogeneity of ideologies and commitments and lose our grasp on the distinctive and overarching qualities of liberalism in America, we forfeit the chance to identify and assess the series of tensions that work within American liberalism, and we displace that which is dissonant within liberalism to other political traditions. My remarks are also based on the observation that what those who have been excluded from liberal rights and participation have most desired is inclusion. Facing so vast a prejudice, W.E.B. Du Bois wrote in The Souls of Black Folk in 1903, "Few men ever worshipped freedom with half such unquestioning faith as did the American Negro." Moreover, in seeking to enter the domain of substantively meaningful citizenship, African Americans took up the three main instruments of political influence that the liberal tradition puts on offer: the demand for rights, the articulation of these demands in the public sphere, and the utilization of the implements of political representation, including the attempt to influence elections and shape lawmaking. They understood what both Hartz and Smith failed to emphasize. While the central mechanisms of a liberal polity can transmit, even amplify racism, under some conditions, they also can serve as vehicles to propel efforts at rectification. The first expression of Hartz's key formulations appeared in two articles published by the American Political Science Review in 1952, asserting that the spectrum of American political ideas and institutions has been confined to a zone that is pervasively liberal. Hartz sought to account for why America has been durably different, even exceptional. He famously argued that having been born free, that is, having never faced feudalism or an ancien regime, and having never known clerical oppression, America fashioned a political tradition so deeply and nearly exclusively based on the political thought of John Locke that the country's central values and institutions, a liberalism of rights and consent, law and political representation, civic equality and market freedom, was so pervasive as to be invisible, unopposed and mostly unarticulated, and never having had to confront powerful opponents. Hartz argued that American liberalism had disappeared from sight, becoming much like the air we breathe. In Europe, by contrast, Locke's ideas about a good regime had served as a fighting force, but not here, where the scope for politics and the range of conflict have been uncommonly narrow. There has been drama, Locke argued, but it lacks range and significance. Unacceptably downplaying the powers of racism in the text, he argued that American clashes are simply Lockean family battles, full of noise, but signifying much less than European conflicts about aristocracy and democracy, the political standing of faith, or totalitarianism and its enemies. Even slavery, said Hartz, was contested on liberal terms. In all, he maintained America's range of political possibilities was much more limited than elsewhere in the West. This, he cautioned, is not a cause for celebration. Taken for granted, the fixed moral unanimity of America's Lockeanism, he argued, risks becoming dogmatic and absolute. Now, if in South Pacific, Ensign Nellie Forbush could not wash that man right out of my hair, scholars in the social sciences and history have been unable to set aside Hartz's arguments. The liberal tradition in America continues to inspire and challenge. To be sure, the book's flaws have been noted by many detractors. The excellent historian of ideas, James Kloppenberg, has characterized Hartz's book as too flat and too static, too silent about race and ethnicity, too still about gender and nation, too quiet about democracy, altogether too simple and exaggerated, in all not a reliable guide to the history of American public life. The political scientist John Gunnell similarly has observed that its construction of liberalism proceeds by mounting an argument that is much stronger on assertion than evidence. Moreover, the text contains no original historical research or falsifiable empirical tests. These criticisms are apt, yet in a crucial respect, they are not on point. They commit a category error. Liberalism in America is not a traditional work of history. It is not a detailed study of political thought. It is not a work of empirical social science. Put to the test of those genres, it fails. What the book does do, however, is locate the United States within a typology of instances. Having done so, it offers a model, a kind of shadow world that deliberately simplifies in order to grasp the central conditioning features of American political life. By specifying the formative role of the country's powerful liberal currents, The book resembles other factually compromised, empirically limited, theoretically uneven, yet compelling books that have fundamentally reorganized our understanding. Leading examples include Max Weber's The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism, Robert Michels's Political Parties, Karl Mannheim's Ideology and Utopia, Karl Polanyi's The Great Transformation, Hannah Arendt's Origins of Totalitarianism, C. Wright Mills's The Power Elite. These books are not monographs, not narrative histories, not research reports. Each is based on secondary research, some flawed. Each deliberately exaggerates its thesis. Notwithstanding, each has radically altered the vectors of more than one fundamental conversation in history and the social sciences. If there are graduate students here, this is not advice about how to write your thesis, though. By contrast to Kloppenberg and Gunnell, Roger Smith's critique was on point. He read Hartz's work for what it is, and he engaged with the book on that basis. For that reason, my more sympathetic but still critical reconstruction and extension of Hartz's audacious claim that liberalism has been the most important underlying force in American history seeks to join the level at which Smith both pitched his criticisms and offered alternatives. In rereading Hartz, I aspire to a more complex understanding of the liberal tradition in America, not as a fixed given, but as the boundary condition of American political life, without giving up what I believe to be his absolutely correct insistence that in America, the status of political liberalism is not commensurate with any other. That is, with Hartz's insistence that the status of political liberalism is not commensurate with any other tradition. Unlike many of Hartz's critics, Smith rightly understood liberalism in America to be an attempt to identify the orienting framework of American political life, rather than the action within it. On this matter, Hartz himself was unambiguous, and I quote Hartz. "So one cannot say of my liberal society analysis," he wrote, "that by concentrating on national unity, it rules out the meaning of domestic conflict. Actually, it discovers that meaning. You do not get closer to the significance of an earthquake by ignoring the terrain on which it takes place. On the contrary, that is one of the best ways of making sure you will miss its significance," end quote. If, by my extension, we were to substitute the word racism for earthquake, then Hartz's sentence would read, "You do not get closer to the significance of racism by ignoring the liberal terrain on which it takes place." It is worth recalling that both Hofstadter and Greenstone adopted a position similar to that of Hartz. Each was fascinated by how the liberal tradition in America explains why America's trajectory has differed from pathways found in Europe, and why the United States has been so much more resistant to anti-liberal political and social movements than countries located across the Atlantic. Though neither fully agreed with Hartz's formulations, each was of the same mind about the status of the Western liberal tradition in the United States. For Hofstadter, Hartz's writing was, quote, "perhaps the most important attempt to generalize the implications of the idea that America was always a liberal community. This claim," he rightly observed, "has somewhat the same relation to historical writing as an appropriate frame has to a painting. It sets the boundaries of the scene and enables us to see where the picture breaks off and the alien environment begins, but it does not provide the foreground or the action. From this perspective, liberal hegemony encloses political life and defines a borderland that may be more or less permeable." But Hofstadter added an important caveat. Liberalism as a frame is more than just a matter of political thought. Crucially, it also is a casing built by structures and institutions that are the products of decisions and behavior. For this reason, Hofstadter insisted that liberalism's contents and causal powers must be carefully articulated in terms of identifiable mechanisms and processes, rather than simply stated or assumed, as in Hartz's gestures in Locke's direction. Greenstone's liberal persuasion made two additional contributions. Borrowing from Wittgenstein, he specified the liberal tradition as a complex and contested boundary condition, a term he defined as, quote, a set of relatively permanent features of a particular context that affect causal relations within it. As a relatively stable cluster of ideas and institutions, political liberalism as a boundary condition, he argued, influences the play of the forces within its territory, and by extension alters circumstances for those outside its ken. Greenstone, as I have noted, also insisted that relative stability not be confused with singularity or stasis. There is more than one species of liberalism, his study of Abraham Lincoln revealed. Boundary conditions are a dynamic site within which differences within a given family of instances can vie with each other. Hofstadter's and Greenstone's articulations point us in a direction that differs from that of Smith. Rather than treat racism a priori as a distinct and independent tradition, they invite us to consider, as did Sklar, when, how, and to what extent race and racism constitute key features of liberalism as the boundary condition of American political life. In no way does this approach downplay these elements of the American experience, but it locates them differently and projects a changed set of puzzles. These are the primary subjects I will consider on Thursday, but first, by way of concluding, I briefly propose how Hartz might be revised to serve as the basis for specifying such a boundary condition. The liberal tradition in America depends as much on the historical sociology of Marx as on Tocqueville, especially the way Marx identified large-scale change in modes of production, starting with feudalism and ultimately culminating in communism. An inverted version of this theory of epochal change underpins Hartz's analysis. Lacking feudalism, he argued, the United States is forever stuck at a capitalist and liberal moment. But the United States did not lack for feudalism. Hofstadter's posthumously published volume, America at 1750, persuasively paints a social portrait of America a quarter century before the Revolution, a portrait that underscores not the absence of feudal relations, but the friction generated by the collision of feudal arrangements and markets in land and labor. Hofstadter underscored the complex history of the tax of quitrents, a feudal land levy imposed by higher landowning authorities, a tax difficult to sustain in an open, competitive land market. In some locations, including Maryland and Virginia, the traditional system of taxation persisted. In others, it did not. Hofstadter concluded, and I quote, that feudal monopoly and capitalist monopoly, as they moved into the wilderness, thus impeded and tripped over each other. Even more important were the tension-charged circumstances of labor, whose supply was not adequate for the burgeoning colonial economy in terms of the number of voluntary migrants. Quote, hence two other solutions were resorted to. I'm quoting Hofstadter, the importation of increasing numbers of Africans and the immigration, advertised, subsidized, suborned, lured, forced, even on occasion kidnapped of white persons without capital, indentured servants, who would, if fortunate, work their way to freedom and independence. White servitude, the slave system, and free white labor all combined in a complex semi-feudal and market system. Liberal economic, social, and political alternatives were advanced as a means to overcome these contradictory and charged patterns. For a growing, if still a numerical minority, but politically dominant middle class, liberal ideas and institutions were, in these circumstances, not a given or a fact of nature, but an object worth fighting for. By the time of the Revolution, white servitude had largely disappeared, and the distinction between freedom and slavery was fully coded by color. American liberalism, likewise, was a more complicated construct than Hartz suggests. American liberalism was not a direct import from Locke's second treatise, as Hartz's designation of the United States as Lockean implied. It was rather a particularly thick and capable brand of liberalism, whose polity was shaped when the founders discovered that classical Republican thought, itself an orientation about the people, could not successfully address modern conditions of commerce, a plurality of religions and interests, or a geographic span for political participation and representation of unprecedented size and diversity. To be sure, Hartz was right to note the importance of Locke for the founding generation. But as Andreas Kalivas and I sought to show in a book of ours published in 2008 called Liberal Beginnings, America's founders were participants in a cross-national project to make a republic for the moderns. Such key figures as Scotland's Adam Ferguson and Adam Smith, France's Germain de Staël and Benjamin Constant were joined by Tom Paine, James Madison, and other intellectual and political leaders of America's revolutionary moment, who came to understand that the Republican tradition to which they were committed, a tradition of strong civic principles and practices, if unrevised, could not rise to the challenge of the political problems of their time. Faced with the problem of how to form a proper republic after the demise of monarchy and in the context of popular sovereignty, the new liberal boundary condition of American political life, America's founders fashioned, was more than just a body of ideas, but an institutional set of rules to govern relations between the national state and other states in the international arena, between the modern state and markets in land, capital, and labor, and above all, between the state and its citizens. Policing membership, it also was this novel institutional liberalism that had to grapple with the immense and seemingly permanent slave system that played so vital a role in motoring the country's economy, in shaping its expansion, and in determining the very contours of its political order. Crucially, this pivotal aspect of the new regime did not lie outside the bounds of America's constitutional design. To the contrary, the formation of a liberal premise as the boundary condition for the new republic was based on accommodations for the world's largest slave system within the borders of a nation-state, as distinct from slavery located in colonies at some distance from the mother country. This adaptation appeared not just in the explicit constitutional provisions about the temporal limits of the slave trade or the 3/5 enumeration of slaves as semi-persons for purposes of political representation, thus overrepresenting the slave South and protecting its distinctive interests. It also was the shaping force that produced a Senate with 2 members for each state, irrespective of its size or population. And it was the condition that freedom and slavery would coexist that generated the concurrent assumption that no change would come to the slave system by way of simple majorities, but only by cross-regional consent. The United States, thus, was not just a slave-holding republic, as the great historian Donald Fehrenbacher once called it, but a country whose frame was composed by a slave-holding liberalism, a liberalism based across all its regions on the idea of a white republic, a commitment that also generated the country's first immigration law that offered undemanding naturalization and admission to liberal political fellowship to white newcomers while excluding free persons of color, a discordant contrast to us, but not to our founders. Based on these understandings, the task I will pursue on Thursday understands the United States not as a site of distinct Republican, racist, and liberal traditions that have existed side by side, but comprehends the unchaste accommodation to racism by our dominant liberalism with Republican roots. My discussion in that second lecture will pivot on 4 dates: 1835, when Tocqueville, his traveling companion Gustave de Beaumont, and the novelist James Fenimore Cooper all published major works on American democracy that took up the relationship of liberalism and racism. 1909, when President William Howard Taft explained to his inauguration audience why Jim Crow rules were consistent with the Civil War amendments that had promised equal protection and voting rights to the country's emancipated slaves. 1919 to 1922, when the NAACP led a failed campaign to convince Congress to pass an anti-lynching statute. And 1944, when weeks before D-Day, Congress did legislate on the subject of soldier voting, passing a law written by 2 of the legislature's most committed segregationists. I will treat these moments as opportunities to propose an alternative way to think about the relationship of liberalism and racism, a view that underscores how features inherent to the liberal tradition, especially the nature of rights, the institutions of political representation, and the character of mass opinion in a vibrant public sphere, facilitated the development of a racial republic while also offering tools to surmount its barriers to membership. The last word belongs to Judith Shklar. She urged us to develop what she called a liberalism of fear, not a liberalism that tries to fashion a perfectly just world, but a liberalism that comprehends how the greatest human evil is, quote, cruelty and the fear it inspires. What is so striking about the history of America's liberal tradition is how it has served both as an instrument of racial cruelty and, as Shklar so fervently wished, as an indispensable weapon against racism and against the fear that racism inspires. Thank you very much.